May 2nd. We have been marching, sometimes double time. Covered 15 miles yesterday, despite poor roads and heat, leaving behind extra clothes, books, and whatever else was not absolutely necessary. Lieutenant Toms did not say much to me all day, other than, "Keep them moving, Sergeant. If the Major can keep his guns moving, we can keep our men moving." At one river crossing, one man, George Chittenden, was swept down the water, but we managed to drag him to shore before he went under. We heard later that 2 men was not so lucky when their wagon overturned. Today we covered 18 hard miles, and the men are exhausted. Several of them are missing tonight due to straggling. Sergeant Donahue is doing paperwork, and Sergeant Drake is nowhere to be found, so I am going back for the missing men on my own. Later. Went back a mile or two and found 4 of our men off to the side of the road in a cozy glen with men from other companies who had also dropped out of the line of march. There was a fire and a pot of coffee and a kettle with some sort of bean stew boiling away. A pleasant domestic scene, I thought. When I entered, most of our men seemed embarrassed at not having kept up with the rest of the company, and at having to be sought out like schoolchildren. But they was nice enough, and even offered me a cup of coffee. Charlie Shelp was there, and was not happy to see me. I told our men that Lieutenant Toms wanted them back in camp, and Shelp said, "I am not leaving till I eat." The men from G Company encouraged Shelp, and one said, "You can't order an injured man to march, and this man is injured. I saw him limping myself. It's against the rules." Shelp looked pleased that he had such loyal supporters, and shook his head in agreement. I may be mistaken, but I believe Shelp's courage was bolstered by the whiskey the men was passing around. "Yes, it's against the rules," he agreed. If I was Sergeant Donahue, I would have made Shelp and the others obey with my fists, but I am a full head shorter than the sergeant and a lot lighter. There was not much I had to use against them except my words, and I wasn't sure they would work. "If you are really injured," I said to Shelp, "you should report to the doctors. But you don't look injured to me, Private, just hungry. Have your dinner, and then find us up the road a ways." The men from our company seemed happy with this solution, and even some of the other men, the ones who had backed Shelp, looked satisfied. But Shelp said, "You can't make me go to the doctors. You can't make me do anything." "I am not going to make you do anything, Private, but I will tell you that when final roll call is taken tonight, you had better be in camp or at the doctor's, and not in between." Shelp began to say more, but I turned from him, wished the rest of the men a fine meal, and said good night. Sergeant Donahue would have had those men marching back with him, and no back talk either, so I felt very much alone as I walked to where we had camped. I am not at all sure I am up to this business of being a sergeant. 10 o'clock. Final roll call taken. All but C. Shelp are in camp. May 3rd. Shelp still absent, and the assistant surgeon in charge of the field hospital says no Charlie Shelp is in their care. We are to march at any moment, so there is no time to look for him, or to write about it. May 4th. We have met up with the rest of the 122nd, and the rest of the army as well, and crossed the Rapidan at Germanna Ford. We was near the head of the march, and among the first across with orders to go to Culpeper Plank Road, a mile, and hold the area till the rest of the army could get across. A force of Sheridan's cavalry was already swept ahead to clear the roads, and we were to follow them as closely as possible to rid the surrounding woods of Reb's skirmishers. The land is fairly open and rolling here, with stands of trees and some burned-out houses about, but mostly unplowed fields. A dark line of the woods is up ahead to greet us, and that is why the area beyond is referred to as the Old Wilderness on most maps. Lieutenant Tom said that we might have 80 to 100,000 troops behind us by tomorrow night. Noon. We was ordered forward again and told to secure another mile of the road. There are about 400 soldiers in this group, plus a number of Major Pettit's light artillery and some cavalry. Behind us we can see the landscape already swarming with troops and wagons and ambulances and other equipment. I am not happy to be showing myself so clearly to the Rebs, but I must admit to a proud feeling when I see so many fellow soldiers. We had just begun to move when Charlie Shelp suddenly appeared, panting heavily and covered with leaves and dirt, and looking as if he hadn't slept a wink. The others greeted him warmly, and he was smiling when he joined the march, and I might have let him alone and been done with it, but I couldn't. If I didn't say something to him, then I would not be doing my job, and he knows what he or someone else would do next. So I called out, "Private Shelp, you will step out of the line." I admit that I was about as scared as when we had to go into a fight, but I went over to where he was by the side of the road anyway. You did not report for roll call last night or this morning. Do you have a reason for being absent? I was at the doctor's, he said, having my injury treated. Then you have your discharge orders from the doctor, I said. He looked startled for a second, then felt his vest pockets and said, I guess I dropped them when I was running to get back here. You weren't with the doctor's private. I checked. You were on report, and when we are finished out here, you will be dealt with. Do you understand? Now get back in line. Shelp stood quiet for a few seconds, and I could tell he wanted to hit me. Only too many was around to see, and his punishment would be even more severe if he did that. But as he walked past me, he mumbled, We'll see who gets who back, Sergeant. If I was scared before, now I was stunned. A few moments ago, I had to worry about the enemy I might have to face. Now I have to worry about the one who is marching along with me as well. 6 o'clock. At around 2 o'clock, the woods closed in on both sides of the road, a scraggly collection of oak and pine trees, alive and dead, standing up and falling over, with vines and ill-formed shrubs all around. The road is about 20 or 30 feet wide, so we had to march shoulder to shoulder, and what a tight feeling that gave us all. A little on and we halted and sat by the side of the road, having a hardtack meal. The officers had a meeting, and then we sergeants met with our lieutenants, and they told us to be alert and that we might run into the enemy at any moment. Both things we all already knew, but the officers, being mostly lawyers, probably thought it was best to hand down this information officially. When I got back to the men, I found Johnny writing to his mother and sisters. I told myself that I should write to Sarah just as soon as my sergeant duties allow, which might be a while. I noticed how steady Johnny's hand was and commented on how calm he seemed. He said he is all excited inside, but does not see the point of showing it. I will either survive a fight or not, and it isn't on my hands anyway, he said, and looked up. He knows what will happen to me, and that is good enough for me. Most of the men believe similarly, and while a few believe there is no divine hand involved in any of this. While I was with Aunt and Uncle, they said God rewarded us according to our thoughts and deeds. I can understand that I have been bad enough to wind up here, but I cannot believe that Johnny has done anything to deserve being shot at or killed. And if he hasn't, then why is he here? I am not smart enough to see what the grand scheme is, but these thoughts rattle around in my head, and I try to make some sense of them. The bugle has sounded, and we are about to march on. I glanced up and saw our men getting ready to march. Then I spotted Shelp. He is on the other side of the road, staring right at me, right through me, his eyes as dark and menacing as any stormy night. I am telling myself to be calm and finish up this entry, but a cold shiver goes through me anyway. 9 o'clock. After our stop, we went another mile more along the plank road, then took a smaller road, more like a rough path, that went off to the right into the thickest sort of woods imaginable. This path is not much wider than a wagon, and in bad condition, with no bridges over streams, so our progress has been slow. We have stopped so the officers can talk over the latest scouting reports. Lieutenant Toms told Sergeant Donahue, Sergeant Drake, and me that Lee's army is 5 or 10 miles from here and headed our way. Fast, according to the scouts. They aim to catch us in these woods, the lieutenant said, so we can't maneuver and use our numbers to full advantage. I don't think they'll do anything tonight, but we have got to get the men ready for a real fight. So I guess Uncle Robert was not fooled a bit by the first soldiers that went out. We are to move ahead another half mile or so, then put up breastworks for tomorrow's fight. The only other thing we know for sure is that we will be on the extreme right flank of our line of battle. May 5th. This is the wildest mess of woods I have ever been in, and believe it is correctly named the Old Wilderness. We happen to be near a substantial clearing in the woods, a very rare thing as far as I can tell, with our cannons on a slight rise with a good view to the other side. Major Pettit has left 20 cannons here at the clearing, back a little in the woods and concealed by leaves, so they are not easily seen. This open section appears to have been an expanse of swamp or a bog that dried up years ago, and left a scattering of dead and collapsed trees, a shaggy grass covering, and some exposed boulders and rocks. The lieutenant told us that our line of battle runs for almost 2 miles to our left, in the general direction of Spotsylvania Courthouse, though the trees and shrubs are so thick that you can't tell if a line exists. The rest of Major Pettit's guns are scattered along this line, and he is agitated as a thunderstorm because the trees will make it hard to use his artillery to the best effect anywhere but in a few open sections. We have been listening to the sound of heavy fighting since sun came up, so the cannons have not been totally silenced. It is quiet here, or I would not be writing this, and we feel quite isolated, but this has given the men a chance to make coffee and breakfast and speculate on what might be going on. I have the new men to watch over, including Theron Chrysler. Also Johnny Henderson, Boswell Grant, Niles Rogers, and Willie Dodd are with me, and of course Spirit is too. Sergeant Donahue said to keep a sharp eye on Chrysler, and to shoot him, in the back if need be, if he tries to run off again. I am not sure I will do this, since I share his fear, if not his inclination to run. This is my group, and I am happy with them, and happy that I do not have Shelp to deal with. Our job is very simple. Last night we took down a line of trees to one side of the clearing for some 300 feet and removed the brush in front as best as possible. Now my men are positioned every 20 or 30 feet along this rough breastwork. Out in front of us are C, A, and K companies. If the enemy tries to get around our flank, they will hold them back out there. If they can't, we are back here to give them covering fire till they reach us. Major Pennant sent word that we were not to surrender this spot on any account, so this could become a very hot place if the men out in front can't hold them. There are more reserves behind us on the path in case they are needed along the line of battle, and I think there are other companies out in the woods, but who can tell? Later. We was just beginning to enjoy a restful morning when the first Reb struck, around 11 o'clock. The fighting from earlier seemed to be coming down along the line of battle, getting closer and closer, but very slowly, so it was not at all alarming. We heard the bugles and the report of a cannon from the other side of the clearing after 10 o'clock, but then the sound died away, and we settled back again, supposing that they had decided to make a fight somewhere else. Some men even began making plans for dinner. Sergeant Drake thinks it is a trick of the wind, that the fighting was actually close by, but the sounds got lost in the woods and did not reach us. Whatever the truth, suddenly our advanced pickets began speaking in the woods across the way, which was followed by a stern volley from the enemy. Then our pickets came across the clearing on the double quick, calling that the Rebs was on their heels, which any fools with ears and a brain already knew. I did not have the best view of any of this, being 200 feet from the closest gun, with my back to the clearing, though I turned often to see what was happening. I was watching when our pickets reached the breastworks and threw themselves over. A scattering of Rebs had entered the clearing by this time, some firing our way, others kneeling to reload, and the rest coming on. Around this time Major Pettit nodded to one of his aides, who gave the order, and one cannon fired canister at the enemy, which sent a hail of metal pieces into the faces of the closest Rebs. This seemed to cool the fighting spirit of them all, because they stopped what they was doing and dove for the ground. And I would have done the exact same. And the attack ceased right there. Major Pettit did not have his other guns fire at the enemy, as they dashed back into the woods, which seemed odd, but at least the few Rebs we saw are gone. Fighting continues in the distance to our left, though few messages have been received today, and the path behind us is still jammed with soldiers, so there is little traffic along it. We may be so far out here that no one cares about us or this patch of dirt. Let's hope so. In the evening, they came on at dusk, something Lieutenant Tom suggested they might do. So I guess they care. The shadows was beginning to lengthen when first one Reb soldier, then 2, 3, 4, and more scurried from the far woods, bent low and searching for what little cover there was. These advanced pickets had been sent out to see what we would do. Naturally our men opened fire on the shadowy targets, and many have picked off 1 or 2. It was hard to tell. 10 more entered the clearing in the meantime, moved forward 100 feet, dodging and ducking, and went to the ground when they found shelter. Pretty soon this small group had minis whistling through the spring leaves at us, and it was our turn to duck. "Find your targets before you shoot," I heard Sergeant Donahue order, as he moved among his group. "Make your shots count. Don't waste a single shot," which was good advice, so I went along my little line and told the same to my 10 men. We had been issued 60 rounds yesterday, but getting resupplied in this tangle of trees will be hard. Our 60 shots might have to last all night and tomorrow. Sergeant Donahue appeared at my side. "Listen for our pickets out there," he instructed me, though he really didn't need to. I had no intention of being caught napping, and then to have to answer later to him, Lieutenant Toms, and Major Pettit. He had just finished speaking when, Whiz, bang! A shell burst over our heads, and fizz, whiz, rattle! The fragments came tearing through the treetops above us, which made us duck even lower and grab hold of our forage caps. When the metal stopped falling, the sergeant looked up at the leaves above, which had been clearly punctured in many places by the metal, smiled and said, "I guess it wasn't our time. Good luck, Peace," then hurried off. We went back to our work then, which became real when the advance pickets from K Company began to be heard. My breathing got faster, and I had an odd sense that things was beginning to happen too quickly around me to see. There are two kinds of changes that I know of. In one, everybody jumps up right away and runs at you. That is, after the cannons have softened up the other side. This is the sort of charge that the Rev. General Pickett made at Gettysburg. The second begins slowly, with little groups of men moving forward, poking and probing in various places to find the softest spot to charge. So in a little while, if they think ours is the easiest to get through, the charge will come. And it was this that had me edgy. "Steady! Steady!" I yelled at my group, but I was really yelling at myself not to think too much. If you don't do much thinking, but watch instead and let your feet and body react, you can keep the creeping shakes under control. "Keep those fingers off the trigger," I added, just in case any of the new boys was feeling jumpy as me and might twitch their trigger finger by accident. All around us it seemed that the muskets was barking and chattering away, punctuated every so often by the sound of a cannon and the whoosh of a shell overhead followed by its explosion, though we still couldn't see what was happening. "Look, Sergeant," Boswell, who was closest to me, shouted, pointing to the clearing. I glanced around and saw a line of butternut uniforms break from cover and begin running across that open space toward our line. Then I heard the sound, a steady wave of it, like the scream of 1,000 wounded animals gone crazy with pain. I'd heard it before, but every time they let out their Reb yell, I have to admit it chills me to the bone. Every so often one of these charging men would be hit by a bullet and fall, opening a gap in their line. Pretty soon this first line looked like a mouth of rotten teeth, though none of those still running seemed inclined to turn back. When the first group had come to about 100 feet, their advance picket stood and joined the charge, while behind them a second line of men emerged from the woods. They were shoulder to shoulder, almost touching each other, they were so close, and screaming as loud as the first line. Thinking back, I guessed that somewhere between 300 or 400 men was charging towards our guns, maybe more. That is when I realized what had happened. Earlier, Major Pettit had fired only one gun, which was enough to warn off the enemy. But they was back now, and eager to get that gun, not realizing that a lot of others waited also. The Rebs was about halfway across when the trap, for that was what it was sprung, and the entire battery fired with an unholy explosion that made the ground and trees quiver. A wall of smoke was instantly created, making seeing even worse, but I saw enough to know that the metal pieces ran across the clearing like a hot scythe, cutting down men, grass, and anything else standing. The damage to the enemy line was severe, and their screams terrible, but it did not stop their charge or our work. I turned my attention to the woods down in front of us, where the fighting was getting louder, and I noticed that some of A Company's men was moving forward. I shouted to my group to be alert and to stop watching the clearing. Another volley from our cannons erupted, followed by more screams and the rapid snap-crackle of both sides' muskets. The breeze shifted, pushing smoke over us and filling up the woods around us. It had already gotten pretty dim, but now the smoke made seeing impossible. In front of us, smoke and shadows and more smoke and shadows drifted through, with an occasional flash of yellow-blue to indicate the position of a musket. I was already nervous enough, but not being able to see made my stomach jump. That's when I decided to make some quick visits, as much to distract myself as to make sure my men was okay. Boswell was first, and I told him to watch the clearing and shout if anything happened there. Then I hurried on. Not much fire was being directed at my group, but Minnie sailed over our heads anyway, so I bent over low when I ran to the next man. That was Theron Chrysler, and he was peering ahead so intently that he jumped a little when I threw myself down beside him. "You okay, Theron?" I asked, and he nodded yes. His eyes was big and round, and I thought I should say something to put him at ease. "Good," I said, and added, but I can tell you that I wish those fellows would go home for the night so I can get something to eat." Theron cracked a smile and said he agreed. Then I told him, "Stay low, here? I'm going to check on the others now. And don't shoot unless you know what you're shooting at, okay?" He nodded again, and then I moved on, going from man to man and saying much the same to each. When I got to Johnny, he seemed very snug and not at all concerned. He was at a spot where 3 trees had come down, and he had piled up bits of woods and rocks to either side of his position, so he could see through a tiny slit between the trees. If an enemy mini-ball was looking for him, it would have to have very sharp eyes. The last one on my line was Willie Dodd, who was tucked in behind a thick section of tree trunk and happily feeding Spirit hardtack. "Evening, Sergeant," he said, as if nothing unusual was happening round him. "Care for dinner?" I patted Spirit and took a cracker. Only when I bit into it, my mouth was so dry, it just sat there like chalk. I looked around quickly, making a real show of studying what was going on in front of us. But of course, I couldn't see anything at all. There were shadows moving around out there, but nothing that suggested the Rebs had broken through. No shouted warnings or urgent bugle notes. The heaviest fighting was still coming from the clearing, which was now way off to my left. Just then our cannons roared again, and I pulled my head back behind the tree and gulped the wad of dry hardtack down, but it got stuck in my throat. "That was something, wasn't it, Sergeant?" Willie said. I nodded, forcing the hardtack the rest of the way down, then managed to say, "Almighty fierce. Sounds like Major Pettit has added some guns over there." A moment later a cheer rose from those very guns and told us the Rebs had given up the charge across the clearing and was withdrawing. The firing continued for 15 or 20 minutes, then died away very quickly. There was a series of shouted commands to stop shooting, to move this company or that one here or there, to see who had been wounded, and then things quieted down. The only sounds left now was the moans and cries of the wounded, most of whom was lying in the clearing. I went back along my line and did another check of my men. A number of men from K and 1 or 2 or 3 from A and C companies were being helped to the path where they would wait for the ambulances, but I think it's safe to say that we did not suffer many losses or serious injuries tonight. Lieutenant Tom said the Rebs was stubborn in their fight, but not dogged, which may mean that we are not very important to their plans. Time will tell. Sergeant Donahue came over to see how we had done and said that no one from our company had been killed, though 3 had been hit by exploding shells: T. Stevens, D. Bernard, and C. Mahar. Fighting up the line had sounded very heavy enough to have most of the reserves on the path behind us moved up the line away from us, but there is no way to tell what has happened. 10 o'clock. When things settled down, a flag of truce appeared from across the clearing, and after some talk the Rebs came out to collect their dead and wounded. The wounded was easy to locate because of their moans and cries for help and water, but it took some time to find all the dead. 10 or more men with torches roamed here and there to search in every dark spot. I remembered the dead Reb boy we'd seen in the woods and thought it a shame that he hadn't been found like these fellows here. Some friendly chatter was exchanged with the seekers, and one Reb, who was 40 feet from our breastwork, said, "See you in the morning, Yanks." But he made a mistake in addressing his comments near Shelp, who responded, "We will see you dead in hell, Johnny." I believe that Reb was genuinely surprised by Shelp's tone, and thought him rude. And so did I. I have to do a report on my men, and then Sergeant Donahue, Sergeant Drake, and I are to meet with Lieutenant Toms. I am going to write a quick letter to Sarah, and have decided to send all of my money to her for safekeeping. Later I will get someone heading to the rear to take my letter back. This will take most of the night, but I am glad for the distractions.